Welcome to Victoria Rumble Room, an island show that likes to turn a spotlight on local, provincial, national, and international issues. And through that spotlight, and by the way, I'm Robin Adair, and through that spotlight, casting an enormous shadow all the way across to his tulip bunker, is my co-host with the most, John Jurisic. John, good to have another show, another crack at the Rumble Room.
Oh, absolutely. I absolutely love this one. And today we're focusing on development, an issue near and dear to my heart, Robin. I've spent many years working with developers, and I was actually a commercial realtor, what seems like 100 years ago, and know a lot of the challenges, pitfalls, concerns. These big issues around building housing of any kind just keep getting bigger and seemingly insurmountable. Homes are getting so expensive, they're almost unreachable, not just for younger families, for anybody. How do we keep the best and brightest on the island if they can't afford to live here, Robin?
It's a problem, and the debate continues to rage between those who say development is inevitable and we need it now, and those who want to maintain our smaller city values and our leafy streets and less congestion. And there's a pro and con on both sides of this. We certainly hear a lot on this topic from our many viewers. Jerry, for example, feels very strongly we need to slow the tide of development, and he writes, "None of us wants to face the truth. Victoria is too small for any more development for the rest of Canada." And I've heard others say something similar to this around the BC ferries. They were saying we should have fewer ferries coming to Vancouver Island, less encouragement of coming to live on Vancouver Island. People should stay away and leave Vancouver Island the way it is. And I just don't think that's very realistic.
None of it's realistic. Such a closed door philosophy, old school philosophy, a negative philosophy. I don't support any of it. Victoria is the mildest climate in the country. We get half the rain they get in Vancouver. People from across the country want to live here. And often the ones that arrive can't afford to buy here because they've done well in other places. They've sold their homes. They've got bringing lots of capital. The problem is the prices keep climbing. And our younger generation, likely an older generation downsizing, can't barely afford the rent, let alone the opportunity to buy a home. We need young people for everything, especially two of the largest industries locally, that being tourism and hospitality. These are our future, people and industry. We need to find a way, Robin, to house them.
Absolutely. And the province has been stepping forward with announcements of building more low-cost rental. But the private sector really needs to step up in a meaningful way. And the civic governments need to unleash them and take away some of the red tape to allow them to do this. It means more density, though. And a case in point is the proposed development by Bayview for the Roundhouse property, which sits in behind the Songhees property, right in the inner harbor of Victoria. Ken Mariash proposing, I think, a proposal in a busy place that really, I think, has some merit.
Yeah, you bet. Ken is proposing a new 9-building development around the historic Roundhouse. Some neighbors are up in arms because some of these buildings will be nearly 30 stories high. Bayview tried to build a smaller scale project a decade ago. It didn't work at that time. So now it's another effort in the face of opposition to this development.
Keith Dagg has worked with Bayview as a consultant. He's known the Mariashes for decades, and he says density is really a must for this new proposal. He gave us an example, his rationale. The last time, and this was a decade ago, that they brought this proposal forward, Thrifty Foods had said, yes, we'd like to build in the Roundhouse. We'll put a state-of-the-art grocery store right in the Roundhouse. And then they walked away from it because they said it doesn't have the density. There aren't going to be enough people to live in that immediate area. And here's really more of what Keith has to say on the matter.
They said build the buildings and we'll be here, and we'd like you to remember us to get us in here first because we want to be part of this. But until you build some buildings, there's not enough business in Vic West to handle. I mean, there's only 3 buildings built in that entire area right now. So, and the reality is, again, you're talking about a massive piece of property. I mean, if you take the entire 20 acres that's up there in Bayview, it's equal to the land from our place on Pandora to the Empress Hotel. That's how big it is. So, even with 9 buildings, there's going to be tons and tons of room on that piece of property. So I just don't get it. And I guess to me, the really sad part about it is they've got people out there, fighting to stop it. And they've got petitions running. And they go into our buildings over there and they try to sign people up and scare them that the buildings coming there are way too high and so on. In the meantime, we try to meet with that group, and none of them will come in our office. So I just don't know how people can operate like that. They can talk and talk and talk, and the fellow leading it, McGinnis, he lives in James Bay. He doesn't even live there, and I just don't get why people, if you have a problem, come and talk to the people that can solve the problem. The good news is all the councillors have come and visited us. They know the plan. We need housing. I mean, that's the reality of life, and it ain't going to happen unless we get the right building and go in there. And if as Ken and Patty bought this place in 2000, can you imagine the taxes that would be coming in off those buildings if somebody in the city had have jumped behind this thing and got it finished?
Even the person I spoke to from the opponents said it's not that we're against a development, we just are against the size of these buildings.
Well, I mean, the reality is, you look downtown and you can see lots of tall buildings, and the buildings there, because the ground is so lower, it wouldn't be as high as Promontory in the upper place. So I'm just not sure what they're concerned about. I mean, it's you come into a harbor in a city like Victoria. I mean, and we're not talking about 40-story buildings. We're talking under 30 stories. And a lot of them aren't that big either. So but I just don't see the problem. And it's interesting because that didn't come up at all when we were in council about the height. And quite frankly, planning's the same way. The planning department has been recommending we go to 38 stories on some of the buildings. And we're saying no, we're probably better to stay under 30.
That's one of the things that opponents also are concerned about, is that we're damaging our heritage by rushing to develop. Do you see any other way to revamp and rebuild the Roundhouse without going to a major housing development?
Well, no, because you need the money to do it. But nobody's going to tear down the Roundhouse or the car shop or any of those kind of things. They're going to work with the. I mean, when we had thrifties in there, they were just rubbing their hands at how they could take that area and make it into a beautiful grocery store with in those buildings. I mean, the buildings are solid, so I don't see those buildings going away at all. We have to get on with this thing. The reality is, we need housing, and with the prices the way they are, they ain't going to happen unless we get a lot of building going on, and that project can never happen unless you get a lot of buildings there. I mean, who's gonna come in there and do $40 million worth of remediation and try and pay for that with 4 or 5 buildings?
As it happens, Keith Dagg is celebrating his 87th birthday. Happy birthday to Keith Dagg. He's part of an outstanding group of Victoria business people who've changed our region for the better and have been working for the community for many, many years, behind the scenes in making our community such a great place to live and work. He's won Lifetime Achievement honors from the Victoria Chamber and Tourism Victoria. His name carries phenomenal credibility.
He really does have a credibility that very few people can match in this community. And it's great. We'll certainly look forward to the public hearing that's going to be coming up. They say as soon as October, and that will be on the future of rezoning for the Roundhouse development. And both sides of this issue need to be heard from. They need to be clearly heard from because it's important everyone gets their point of view across I only wish they were talking to each other. And I think that's too bad that that isn't happening. And Johnny, we're going to stay now on the whole development topic with our next important guest.
Effective communication does mean two people talking to each other, doesn't it, Robin? And there needs to be more of that in this entire question around housing. Another man with enormous credibility and a long track record in this housing debate is Casey Edge, the executive director of the Victoria Residential Builders Association. Many people know that as VRBA. Let's zoom him in. Welcome back to the Victoria Rumble Room, Casey Edge. Great to have you back.
Great to be here, as always.
Oh, yeah, fantastic. We're just around, as soon to be entering the second part of the business year into the fall, so things start to connect with people. They're going back to school. Let's talk about housing. We keep hearing calls from the province to get proactive, build a lot more housing to meet rising demand. God, I've heard that so many times. Yet many of the same people who support the NDP government and progressive civic councils don't like the size and scope of recent proposals. So let's kind of get into the nitty gritty here a little bit. A case in point, Bayview Properties, that's downtown Victoria, overlooking the water. It is the property in question, wants to develop the Roundhouse. They say they need high density to draw businesses to new commercial centers, but their neighbors say that the buildings are too many of them and too high. How do we get this going? What's your viewpoint on this?
Well, you have to have economy of scale to build in Victoria. That's just the reality. And the people who created that is Victoria Council, continually trying to grab more money from through DCCs and community amenity contributions and all the rest of it. They keep raising the costs of doing business there. They continue to create more obstruction, a longer process. And so the only way to address that is you have to get economy of scale. I mean, if you look at a good example is the city of Victoria passed rezonings for missing middle housing in January, and not a single application has come forward because there's no economy of scale with townhomes. So at the end of the day, if you really want affordable housing and all the rest, then you've got to reduce the fees, the taxes, the regulatory obstruction. There was a recent study by Paul Sullivan, and he says that home builder application processing times have tripled from 10 to 20 years ago. He says the government fees and taxes now consume as much as 29.25% of building a condo in Vancouver. So you can't have your cake and eat it too. So if you're concerned about density, then do something about the fees, taxes, regulatory obstruction.
But they have talked a lot about the need to get more density along the major arteries, and that would be the way to move people. There's bus routes. They're certainly doing that in places like Vancouver along Cambie, where the subway runs, and it's quite measurable if you drive down that street now, seeing all these buildings going up on both sides. And a similar vision, I think, is being sort of visualized for Victoria. Are you in favor of what Ken Mariash and Bayview are proposing in general? And will you be speaking when there's a public hearing? We presume pretty soon City Hall will have a hearing on rezoning. Will you speak on their behalf or speak out on this issue publicly?
We support housing in general. That location is ideal for a high density project. When it comes to specific projects going up for public review, there has to be some kind of community interest for the association to be involved. We will advise our members of projects that are moving forward, and they will, if there's an interest by them, they will attend those kinds of meetings. See, at the end of the day, I have to come back to this. The numbers have to work. That's the bottom line. And whether somebody's opposed to something or for something, the question is, does it pencil? Does it work? And just because somebody wants to cut back the size of a project, that doesn't mean that it can be done. And so developers often will have a look at where they are building and determine whether they can make the numbers work.
Well, I can tell you our viewers have a ton to say about this. We've had quite a bit of commentary. Almost makes me feel like we should be presenting. Of course, that's not going to be the case. But I can tell you a trend of comments that we have been getting, and that is that we should be building less. I suppose everyone who is opposed to something, they write on social media. The people in favor don't, it appears. That certainly, that kind of opinion discourages newcomers from coming to the South Island. If we build less, and Casey, if some of the viewpoints that you're proposing, and that certainly Robin and I have heard and support, which is increased density for younger people to live here and raise their families, what if none of this stuff happens, Casey?
So the idea that you can just do nothing and leave things as they are, it doesn't work. Eventually, your system collapses because you need that regeneration of population. And so if you're going to regenerate the population, you have to build housing for them. What are we missing? We're missing middle housing for young families. It's absolutely critical for these people to find housing in our community, and municipalities that are blocking that housing, that's just a non-starter. And we had half a dozen municipalities where no missing middle housing was built last year. You have clearly obstructive municipalities that really want no density. You're talking about the project downtown. What about Metchosin, where there is no purpose-built rental multifamily housing in Metchosin? And it's not because it's all, if you read the housing needs reports, it'll say this. It's not because it's all ALR. It's because they don't want that housing. North Saanich, you have a very anti-development, anti-housing group up there as well. And that's just a non-starter. If all the municipalities behave that way, the price of housing goes far beyond where it is right now, and we have no population growth, and the system starts to collapse because there's no new money coming in.
And we've heard this repeatedly about the rail yard project. And just saw a nice article written by Carla Wilson in the Times Colonist. Chris Lefebvre was the developer behind that, and it was in an industrial site. They've created this development that is right by the Gorge Waterway. The buildings there are not big. They're not tall, and it's a different kind of concept that seems to work for the imagination of a lot of people, what they would like to see for development for the entire city. Would this type of housing really meet the housing shortage that we're facing?
Well, I have to come back to if the numbers work today. That project, what's that? That project is about, what, 20 years old now, when it was first started? The numbers in terms of what the municipalities were demanding were much different than what they are today. So you may want something, but the question is, are the municipalities cooperating to make it happen? And I'll tell you straight out, they're not. They will continually increase. So what? Saanich raised their DCs a couple of years ago by 180%. Souk raised their DCs by 98%. Central Saanich raised their DCCs by 100%. I mean, these kinds of increases, it's not like the rate of inflation, 2% a year. Okay, they have raised them for 10 years, it's 20% or whatever it is. They're going way beyond that. These municipalities post $1 million surpluses off of permit fees annually. Now, a permit fee is not a tax. It's supposed to be a fee for service, for an inspection. Their housing starts have declined while their permit fees have increased because permit fees are based on the cost of construction, which goes up. So it's being charged as a tax, even though it's not supposed to be a tax. And so you have all of these three levels of municipalities increasing, taxing housing, and then they expect some form of affordable housing to take place. I'll give you an example. Like, so in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s, there was lots of housing built. And actually there's more, and the numbers were similar to what we have today in terms of housing starts. But Canada had half the population. So relative to our population, our housing starts have actually declined by about 40%. A time when it was possible to build housing affordably and lots of it to accommodate a large population of incoming immigrants and also young baby boomers back then, people like my age. I was in my 20s and had to have a place to live. And so there's lots of rental, lots of housing being built to accommodate the demographics and the immigration. And what is the difference? The difference is that government was not using housing as a cash machine, and there were far fewer regulatory obstructions. That's the bottom line.
Okay. I was optimistic a year ago when I heard about this missing middle initiatives. I thought, wow, finally, maybe a little turn in the road. I'd like to know from you what would have to change. You've identified some: lower DCC costs, lower permit fees, lower taxes.
Yeah, the problem with these regulations is when you start drilling down into them, their demands are such that in terms of the construction, the process, and all the rest of it, that the numbers don't pencil. Like it's just not worth doing. And that has to change. The process at the City of Victoria has to change. There are builders that have told me, frankly, we're not building there. If I can avoid the City of Victoria, I will. The same thing has happened with Saanich. Just I'll give you an example. I was contacted by a government official 7, 8 years ago, whatever it was. Casey, why don't your members bid on government housing projects? Because we need to get our costs down, so we need more bidders. And I told them straight out, because the regulatory process that you put them through isn't worth it to them. They're not interested. It's a pain. If you streamline some of your requirements, you may get more interest. But otherwise, a builder would rather go work for a consumer under a pretty straightforward contract where they're not jumping through all kinds of hoops, creating all kinds of costs, and that's it. And so you have to streamline your process. You have to make it reasonably straightforward. And the government so far has not been interested in doing that. And that's the challenge that the Minister of Housing is going to have. And Union of BC Municipalities meetings are coming up in September, and there's going to be a lot of conversations between the housing minister and the municipal representatives talking about, why are you forcing us to do this and all the rest of it. The reality is that with all of the regulatory hurdles and obstruction, see, the government doesn't build housing. The government funds housing. They talk about, well, we're going to get into the housing business. Really, is the BC government going to go out and hire crews and be a project manager? No, they hire the private sector to build their housing. And so, you have to make it worthwhile for these people for the trades and the builders to want to build that housing. Otherwise, they've fallen way short of their goals in terms of government housing. And the reason they have is because they can't get the contractors to work for them. And also because they face the same regulatory obstruction that the private sector does. And why is the government in the business of building housing anyway?
Lots of insight from Casey Edge. Again, a great guest on the Rumble Room. I want to again reiterate that the opponents of the Roundhouse development certainly are not against all development in Greater Victoria. What they object to is the size and scale of the baby proposal. It's not a black and white issue, and it is not clear as day what the outcome should be here, but people need to get their heads around the need for more housing in general. Our regional population continues to explode. We could reach, in our region, 500,000 people in another decade. We could have 500,000 people living on the South Island in as short a time as the next 10 years. And we need to build up in a hurry in Victoria, and we should be doing that on the arteries. And if we do that on the busy arteries, that'll leave the leafy neighborhoods to less development and less pressure. I think that might be the way to go, but this all has to be clearly and openly discussed.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Robin. That's exactly. Prices will only moderate and somehow stop going up when we have enough inventory, enough housing to meet the demand at every price level, top end to lower end. So that's another Rumble Room. I'm quite sure many more discussions for you and I on this topic. We again want to thank the now close to 1.3 million cumulative viewers who've turned on our program over the last 2 years. And you can also follow us on our flagship, Facebook, on our X site, Twitter, on YouTube, where all of our videos are housed. You can see us, all of them, almost 350 of them now. We're, of course, active on Facebook use groups, TikTok, and Instagram. And as always, I remain Robin, your humble servant, the Croatian sensation, the king of Tulip Road, John Jurisic.
Every time I'm around you, John, I just think of myself somehow as being a serf in your presence, but I still remain Robin Adair, and rumble on.